Thank you. Thank you. You're too good. Hello. Well, I must say I do look forward to these chances, but at the same time, I don't think I have anything especially profound to say tonight, so don't get your hopes up. I wanted to point out this. This is the much larger form, original, is the backdrop for the rites of passage in the Czech Republic. And they painted this. They're one of the most famous Czech artists, Miroslav Rada, did the Christ image. And if you get time to come close, around the four corners are the four archetypes. King, warrior, Jacob wrestling with the angel, lover, the good Samaritan, magician, presumably a prophet. So we have the King of Kings, as it were, and we're going to be talking about the elder king archetype. He's the one who can hold all four together. The more you can hold together, the more of an elder you are. Some people are just elders of, south side of Brooklyn, which is fine. I hope someone is. But when Christians dare to speak of Jesus, King of Kings, we're saying he's the big elder. Yeah. There's nothing he can't forgive. There's nothing he can't hold together. And he holds in his psyche all four parts of the male psyche. I know a lot of you who have come in more recent years didn't participate in those early retreats we gave in the early 90s. That was my first work up at Ghost Ranch on these four archetypes: king, warrior, lover, magician. Just wanted to say this since it's sitting up here. And we're very happy. The Czechs came to visit me last week and brought this on their flight all the way from Prague, a much smaller version of the huge, beautiful backdrop. The Czechs have probably like no other country, organized, spread our men's work. Pavel, how many men have been initiated? Where are you?
1,250.
1,250. Yeah. And I remember when I asked you early on I could see these Czechs know how to make things happen. And I said, why are you so successful? Maybe it was you who said it, I don't know. But one of the men said, because we were raised communist. And so communism isn't totally bad, all right? They learned how to be faithful to a cell group, to a small group. And the only place where our men's work grows strong and grows deep is when men remain committed to one another. We Western individualistic countries, we don't tend to know how to be committed to anything, right? Even a few days like this, or a burden, we want to run off. So we'll talk a little about the king archetype. The elder, which is the theme these days, is simply another form of the king father archetype. So archetype is a word if you're not familiar with it, we stole from Carl Jung. And he said that in the psyche, there seem to be ruling images that configure our experience. And then Robert Moore, who just, actually committed suicide a few years ago, did the work trying to unpackage why and how this was true. And he read the great mythologies and fairy tales and legends and scriptures of the world. And without much pushing, he proved to a lot of us, or made evident, demonstrated, that in story after story, legend after legend, you will find these same four figures emerge: the king, the lover, the warrior, and the magician. Now those take different names, but we used to, in the early men's retreats, we'd take the four Gospels as Christians and just say, I want you to find where Jesus is operating as a king, where he's a warrior, where he's a lover, where he's a magician. And the four tend to regulate and balance one another. If you're only one, you tend to be a not so good one. If you're a king and only a king, you tend to be a bad king. If you balance that king with some warrior energy in the good sense, and there is a good sense, magician energy, wisdom energy, prophet energy, and lover energy, you've got a wise and whole and holy man. So I wanted to at least reintroduce that a little bit tonight, because I haven't been talking about it for 15 years. Some of it is in this book, Wild Man to Wise Man. Okay, now, with that as a bit of a setting the stage, when I was driving down here, or up here from Albuquerque yesterday, even then I said, what am I going to tell them? They've heard everything I possibly have to say. And so I did something that I hardly ever do, which is listen to myself. I just get bored with Richard Rohr, you know. But I went in our little bookstore there, and I saw a CD set, or CD I made, How Men Change. And I listened to it on the way up here, and I said, maybe this would be a good starting place. So I've asked the team to record it, and I'm just going to have you listen with me to about the first 10 minutes of that talk. Part of it is it's filled with some numbers, and I wouldn't remember them all. But let me point out when I was saying this. Those of you, well, you all would remember the economic meltdown in 2008. This was right after that, when the United States and much of Western Europe was in major shock about the need for capitalism to reform itself, that it clearly did need regulation. And I recognize that I gave this talk, it was a webcast, on Groundhog Day, February 2nd of 2009. And I used Groundhog Day to illustrate the thin times that the Celts talk about. November 1st and 2nd, February 1st and 2nd. They said those were the times when the veil between this world and the next world was most thin. You've probably heard this. They're called the thin times. So the Catholic Church took November 1st and 2nd and made it All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day. February 1st and 2nd were the day we blessed the candles to bring light into the darkness. And the secular version of that was Groundhog Day, of all things, where even the poor groundhog saw his shadow. But it's shadow language, and right between the summer solstice. So I just want to give you that bit of preparation, and I think Peter has recorded this, so if you'll listen with me just for about 10 minutes, you'll see where I'm going. Good morning. I've been with these guys already a few days, but we welcome all of you into this larger circle. And I think this is the fifth time we've done this. But it's still a wonder to me that technology can allow us this marvelous opportunity to talk to people right in front of us, but to connect people from all over the world. So pray that I say something that's worth your time. It's sort of timely for me. As some of you know, I just spent last weekend addressing the Army chaplains in Florida. And I think that's going to determine my beginning point. In preparation for talking to them, I read a book by Edward Tick called War and the Soul, and I read James Hillman's book, A Terrible Love of War, in which he really examines the history of humanity, and about the only constant in humanity is that we've always been fighting one another. And one particular page that I thought I'd share with you is a sad page, but it makes the point that men don't change very easily. Men don't like to change. And because men are almost programmed not to change, but to solidify their opinions and their identities, it almost always leads to killing one another. Wars in humanity, Hillman says, is captured probably best by poets and novelists. Their imagination reaches into the afflicted soul beyond the mere reporting of statistics. but the facts themselves are bare and awful. Inhumanity reduced to statistics. One, I think it was Stalin said, one death is a tragedy if you get to know one person's story. But suddenly when you say 150,000 people died, it's a statistic. And the humanity of the situation, the tragedy of the situation is entirely gone or lost to us. But nevertheless, he says, let's transfigure these statistics and look at the cold death in cold numbers. Just the 1990s, when we were all alive. 2 million dead in Afghanistan, 1.5 million dead in the Sudan, 800,000 butchered in 90 days in Rwanda, 500,000 dead in Angola, 250,000 dead in Bosnia, 200,000 dead in Guatemala, 150,000 dead in Liberia, 250,000 dead in Burundi, 75,000 dead in Algeria. Now remember, each of those is somebody's husband, somebody's son, somebody's family, somebody's grandfather. There's a story behind each one of those. So move it from statistics to human beings, which we are. His litany goes on through Chechnya, Sierra Leone, Northern Ireland, Kosovo, the Persian Gulf War, where perhaps as many as 35,000 Iraqi citizens were killed. The U.S. Defense Department estimated that 100,000 Iraqi troops retreating from Kuwait in 1991 had been killed in what was called a turkey shoot. In the wars of the 20th century, not less than 62 million civilians have perished. Civilians. These are women and children and old men. World War I delivered up 6.5 million German casualties, more than 3 million British, 4 million French, and 4.5 million Austro-Hungarians. Add to this the Russians, the Italians, the Turks, the Bulgarians, the Australians, the Americans, 21 million. He goes on, but you can't take much more. This is our lifetime. And I want to point out to those of us, most of us from a Christian tradition, the vast majority of those countries I listed were Christian. People who claim to have based their life on Jesus of Nazareth. And 2,000 years after Jesus, his message has had so little effect on the people who claim to be his followers that we've been at the forefront, or at least in the middle of, many, if not most, of these wars. So, brothers, I wanted to begin, and sisters online, with these statistics to maybe make it rather blatant and contemporary and honest about how little human beings have been trained to change. I talked to someone this last year who said that he asked on one of his retreats how many people on this particular retreat were at one time very certain about something in which they are no longer certain. And in this particular group, not one person could raise their hand. That's how defended, this was a men's retreat, the male psyche is. We're hardened silos. We are by nature defended, and they tell us that's what allowed us to fight these wars, that we don't allow things to influence us, to hurt us. So it's been a survival mechanism. Just don't let events, circumstances, people influence you that much. Don't let things change you. Those of you who've seen the work we've done on the male and the female journey, you perhaps remember that the feminine psyche is a much more permeable membrane, for good and for ill. She allows herself to change, to be influenced by events, personalities, circumstances, biographies, stories, which is probably why she can cry. more easily than most of us can. Now, the downside of that, of course, for the woman is that negative events, if she's abused or raped, also hurts her much more than men can imagine, because she allows events to change her, to influence her for good and for ill. We block, and we say, no, I'm not going to let it touch me. It's allowed us to survive, if you want to call it survival, all of these wars. But I think what I want to say here is that we really haven't survived. And that all of these wars, which has been the story of history itself, has in many ways closed down the male capacity to change. And in fact, the title we gave today, How Men Change, I guess the first thing I'd say is they don't. They don't unless they have to. And I'm just watching myself in that. But I know I'm speaking, brothers, for most of you too. Most males don't change until they have to. Be honest. Until circumstances, economic disasters like we're facing now, moral failure, relationship failure, until it's sort of pushed right in our face. Our tendency is always to project the incoming negative judgment somewhere else. We don't do what a lot of groups call shadow work very well. Shadow work is that struggling with the dark side of yourself, recognizing your own inability to face your own shadow self. Because, of course, it's always a humiliation. And when we're trained, as we are as boys, to compete, to win, when winning is the only goal, well, you can't admit anything that wouldn't look like winning. You have to pretend it's not true, or you have to project it onto another group and make them the losers, which for some strange reason is supposed to make me or us the winners. Now, for those of you from the Christian tradition, the classic, of course, paradigm of change, of radical change, is this man called Paul. And I just want to recognize that he's presented in Acts and even in his own letters as an archetypal Christian who moves from darkness to light, who in fact is going on absolutely the wrong path. And it's described as being thrown to the ground. I think a lot of Christian art has him on a horse. It never mentions really that he's on a horse, but we assume he's on a horse. Maybe not. But he himself says, I was thrown to the ground. And he describes himself as being blinded for 3 days. That he couldn't see. And eventually he describes scales falling from his eyes. In his own letter to the Galatians, he says, I had to go off. I talked to nobody. I talked to none of the apostles, no other human being, and I went off to Arabia. It seems to maybe have been about 2 or 3 months. So we have the 3 days of absolute transformation of consciousness that still feels like blindness. Then he goes off for maybe 2 to 3 months to Arabia, his own vision quest perhaps, his own grief work, his own turning his head upside down, and he comes back, of course, and appears in the Christian community, and they're just utterly befuddled, because this is the man who was attacking them, hating them, and now he dares to say, I'm one of you, which it takes him apparently a long time to believe it. But it took him also a long time to believe it. Now, I think most changes are probably not that dramatic. But I bet real change, the real transformation that religion likes to talk about, is at least that hard. And we haven't made it that hard. We've made it largely the changing to a different group, what we call a belonging system. We Catholics even call converts people who join the Catholic Church. Now that might or might not mean there's been any conversion. More often they've changed groups, do you understand? They've taken on some new rituals, some new practices, some new mental beliefs. But belonging systems, changing of your group, is nowhere close to what we mean by the transformation that religion tries to talk about. Very often, if it's not a change of belonging system, it's a change of belief system. I get some new ideas up here, and I decide to agree with them. These are my new ideas. And especially if you sugarcoat those ideas with God talk, religious talk, scripture quotes, boy, it really sounds like you've done something major. Usually, and I don't want to make a blanket judgment, but usually early stage conversion is something that is chosen to enhance my ego, to make me feel more holy, more in control, more superior to you slobs. Do you understand? Because I've now found Jesus, or I've found God. You usually haven't found God at the beginning. You're trying, and I understand this, and I'm sure God understands this, you're trying to find yourself. And you use God to find yourself. Now, that takes at least 3 days for those scales to fall away. Probably 3 months, probably 3 years. For many, it seems to be 30. Because religion and the institutes and structures and protocols and procedures and policies of religion, more often than not, become a long stage waiting room where you just get preoccupied with the right words, saying the words better than other people say them, and proving that their words are the wrong words, which only solidifies that dang ego even stronger. And so religious people are very often even more impervious to change.
So, remember that period where I almost had the courage to talk that way because of the huge humiliation our banking system, our governmental system was going through. I said, this is good stuff. I mean, I'm looking at it as a spiritual director. There's hope of real conversion in America right now. We've seen where our hubris was leading us. And you know where I'm going. It's 8 years later, and we're back into it with a vengeance. No willingness to change. No willingness to admit fault. It's always, always somebody else's fault. That's the most immature male. That's the non-elder. So I'm going to go back to these archetypes, just a little bit that I wrote about in Wild Man book. Let me talk first of all about the positive king. Each archetype has a positive and negative side. I think, and you know that's my point, we're largely led by negative elders today, which is having its influence all the way down. That if circumstances of 8 years ago had almost no ability to educate us or form us, and you who've gone through recovery movements, you know that most people who are addicted, and we are an addictive society to power and money and war, they normally don't change till they hit bottom. Now, I hope God isn't planning, I don't think God operates that way, some big bottom to make us grow up, but it's pretty clear we're climbing into huge, huge arrogance. And much of the rest of the world can see it except America. Because we're into winning, and anything that makes us look like winning, that's the way the dark king operates. But let me give you the good king first of all. So Rada here his son painted the four surrounding images. He used the prodigal son image and father of the king, the good king. So the king holds together a coherent world. If you have a sense of belonging, security, safety, there's a father in the house in some form. Now the irony is a lot of those fathers are feminine today in many families. There's great comfort when the good father rules or reigns. Daddy's home, all is okay. When there is never an experience of a good father, you pretty much grow up inside of chaos. The calm king sitting on his throne is the archetype of centeredness and security within himself. I was thinking if I was able to give you one phrase or one word even to define the elder energy, and I'll take time, I hope, in the course of this talk to broaden it out, but I'm going to call him the undefended man. He doesn't need to defend himself anymore. He really doesn't. So that compliment you gave me, Terry, it's just, you tried that when you were young, you know? And you realize it was all about yourself. It was all about your own status, security, self-image, and so forth. When you can stop defending yourself, you have all kind of leftover energy, you got it, to defend other people. And until you're at that point, I don't think there's any point in calling yourself an elder. Till you have an excess of energy, what Erik Erikson called generativity, that I'm not preoccupied with my country, America first, my church, the Holy Roman Catholic Church, my race, these wonderful white people that I'm surrounded with. That's all non-eldership. That's a small kingdom, or even the dark king. The king is a symbol in mythology of fertility and creativity. That's why they had to hold him together. If he fell apart, the assumption was the whole thing would fall apart. To be in the king's good graces was to be okay at the core. And there's very few of us. I bet we'd all have to admit it. If you're superior or boss or head or father or grandfather, when he tells you you're okay, it's hard not to believe it. When you get legitimated from above, it just soaks all the way through. And liberals don't want to admit that, but it's true. We like validation from above because there's this divine right of kings. When Big Daddy says I'm good, I'm good. And it overrides my own self-doubt. The king is a man who is secure enough to recognize, affirm, and bless goodness when he sees it in others, precisely because he doesn't need to be blessed anymore. He doesn't need it. He draws his authority from inside. And so he isn't codependent. And thank God that language came into our vocabulary, our therapeutic vocabulary. But most of us draw our validation from a horizontal plane of what do people think of us. It takes the form of polls if you're a politician, which we're all subjected to every day. You know, what does the horizontal think? And if you're a dark king, that's about all you have, you know, because there's no inner authority. It's all the outer authority of what do other people say and what do other people think. You can't really threaten the king because he does not need you. And that sounds terrible, but it's actually wonderful. He doesn't even need your admiration. He is the principle of healthy autonomy and very clear boundaries. Now, I'm going to connect this because I think theologically, as you know, with what we Christians call the indwelling Holy Spirit. And most of our churches have a very undeveloped theology of the Holy Spirit. When you don't have a theology of indwelling of the soul, God remains always out there, elsewhere, far away, and has to be cajoled into coming close by good behavior. A developed theology of the Holy Spirit just reverses those engines. You stop looking for praise out here. Oh, it feels good. I mean, I liked it when you clapped for me and I came up, but I don't need it to go to bed at peace tonight. Do you understand? And I bet most of you don't either. But I want you to learn how to holiness and happiness are inside jobs. As long as you're depending upon outside applause or affirmation or validation, you'll live a very insecure life because you've got to keep begging for it. You got to keep advertising yourself, hoping it's coming.
So the greater the king, the bigger realm he can hold together, the more of a king he is. Some are kings merely of their own limited racial group, and that's a start. Many start there. So remember when Martin Luther King lost many of his own black followers because he came out against the Vietnam War. He wasn't just the king of the black folks then, he became the king of the willing white folks, which there weren't very many of at that time. So that's the ambiguity of it all. The more you hold together, I got to warn you, the more enemies you create. That's almost what you were saying in the introduction. I know I have a lot of people who love me, but I have a lot of people who hate me. And poor Pope Francis gets all kind of letters every day about why he should be condemned or stopped or whatever. Because the bigger realm you hold together, all the little realms are threatened. All the little realms want you to be just king of their little group. Some hold together a rainbow coalition. Others preside over the whole domain and hold it together in unity. The name the medieval papacy gave to itself, I don't think it lived up to it very well at all. But it's still inscribed on the papal coat of arms, or at St. Peter's, is Pontifex Maximus. You've perhaps seen it. It means the greatest bridge builder. Pontifex, bridge builder. Maximus, the greatest bridge builder. I wish they'd lived up to that. But at least they had enough sense that was supposed to be their job. Now, Pope Francis, thank God, is living up to it. But you know he's getting far more pushback than I'm getting. There's a lot of cardinals and bishops who would love to, feed poison to this poor man. So whenever you have an archetype of positive energy, probably the closest in the scriptures is David. The more four sides you can hold together, the more of an elder or king you are. David was a king. He was a warrior, killed his 10,000s. Maybe that's a negative warrior, but okay, it's still some kind of warrior energy, and I'll try to give you the good meaning of warrior energy. He danced wildly and nakedly in front of the Ark of the Covenant and had his wonderful affairs with women. So you have to say he was the lover. The one he lacked, you always reject one or fear one. And the one he lacked was the sage or the wise man or the magician or the prophet. Those are all the same. And you remember the story. It's the only time, I'm told, in the entire Hebrew Scriptures where a king ever admits he's wrong is when Nathan the prophet comes and points the finger at David and says, "You are the man. You killed an innocent man." And unbeknownst or unexpected by everybody, David says, "You're right." So the king submits to the magician or the prophet, and we have in that the whole man called David. That's why he's so idealized. People don't know these things rationally or consciously. They're archetypal, unconscious kind of truth. And so when the New Testament comes along and calls Jesus the son of David, that's the whole characteristic we're talking about. We've got a really whole man here who represents all four of them. And when we used to do these retreats where we each take a different archetype, we had no trouble seeing Jesus as king, warrior, lover, and magician. And that's precisely what makes you a king. The fourth archetype becomes the archetype of wholeness that holds all the parts together. So that's my overall advice to you in terms of how do we create elders. Well, we lead them on journeys through the good meaning of warrior. Let me stop at that. What's the good meaning of warrior? Well, clearly it isn't all the wars I was just talking about, which is the bad meaning. Just kill the bastards. Whoever we don't agree with, get rid of them. But the good meaning of the warrior is needed. And I'd be willing to bet a good number of you in this room are good warriors. And what they are men who say there are things worth
suffering, and dying for. Terry talked about being a Marine. When I gave that Army chaplain's retreat in Florida in 2009, because I'm a child of the 60s, I have my biases and prejudices, and I'm tempted to think everybody who joins the military is a bad warrior. And I've just had to learn over the years that ain't true. There's a lot of men in the Navy and the Army and the Marines and the Air Force who are much more ready to give themselves for their neighbor than I am. I talk about it. The way I usually say it is, a liberal Democrat wouldn't die for anybody. Do you understand? Really? Let's be honest. A liberal Democrat wouldn't die for anybody, all right? It's all limousine, liberal, progressive thinking. And there is something beautiful, and you've all met soldiers like this. Maybe you're one of them, or maybe your sons are. These high-minded, earnest young men who really live highly sacrificial lives. Now, the whole key, and let me throw this in quickly, the whole key to being a good warrior is you got to be in submission to a good king. It's a codependent archetype in a good sense. If you don't have a king, a general, a boss telling you what wars are worth fighting and what wars aren't worth fighting, like we've had in much of the recent years, we have all these earnest warriors. I suppose a lot of you watched the horrible series on Vietnam last month. I mean, I just wanted to go to bed crying every night as the heads of our country, president after president, Democrat and Republican, lied to us, all right? That's all documentable, all right? And you think of these earnest young boys, many of them, maybe hadn't made love yet, maybe hadn't found their Brenda, or had their first experience of success or anything, and they got shot down at 19. Just go to the Vietnam Wall and read all those names. Life is so unjust, so unfair. And the earnest obedience of the young warrior, he's just looking around for a general, a king, a good father who's worth following. And when we don't give them to them, the cynicism is immense. And the cynicism that broke loose in this country in the late 60s and early 70s is still with us and is reaching, I think, a toxic point. Then, of course, the lover is that Brenda experience, that beloved experience you talked about, Terry. The encounter with the feminine, which the gay man almost has a head start on in many ways. It's a shame that we look down on him. But that encounter with the feminine softens the warrior. In the Hebrew scriptures, I don't know if you know this, 2 weeks before the Jews went to battle, they couldn't have sex with their wife. They were forbidden to have, because that would soften them up. That would get them into the heart space. That would get them tender and sweet. We don't want soldiers who are tender and sweet. All right? We want hard men who are disconnected from the feminine. So the lover is always the nurturing, caring, sweet. I was telling one of the Haitian brothers here, every Haitian I've ever met in my life is always sweet. And these big black macho men, and then they talk to you so sweet. I say, how did you put those two together? Well, some cultures do, but most of us don't. We accept our cultural definition of maleness or fatherhood. Macho it usually is. The magician was the last one accepted by David, and is very often the last one accepted by men in general. Because we're first attracted to the warrior. It's our testosterone. We love to kick ass. We love to be first. Who's got the biggest is the overwhelming male question. It's always power, power, power. Don't look at this picture. It looks like Jesus does, I think. We're always wanting to be the most powerful. Those of you who attended those early rites of passage up at Ghost Ranch, remember I had to have the biggest drum. I didn't even bring it. It's too big. I still have it at home. And I always would start and say, I got the biggest, you know. What silliness. See, I wasn't an elder yet then. I was trying to be, though. So the magician is probably, the search for the magician is probably what made some of you start listening to those cassette tapes. Huh? It's probably what brought a lot of you here this weekend. Our work here, and I believe the work of New Warrior Training, by the way, is very much the work of the magician. If you want one word to put together the prophet, the sage, it's the gift of transformation, how to turn darkness into light, how to turn sin into forgiveness, how to turn hatred into reconciliation. If your minister is not an agent of change, as it were, pulling rabbits out of hats, making something out of nothing, making light out of darkness, he isn't a minister. He isn't. If he's just confirming the worst impulses of the south side of Chicago, or the worst impulses of your racial group, he's no minister, all right? He's a bad king. And a lot of bad kings have emerged in the ministry, not really wisdom figures at all. So there's a desperate search for wisdom. It's the search for the often rejected male archetype. Because, you know, in many families, you know this to be true, we left that role to the woman. She was the one who was supposed to pass on religion to the kids. In most Italian, Spanish families, the father never talked about religion. He didn't even go to church, all right? The whole world of values was handed on by the woman. She kept the social calendar. She decided who we meet with, who comes into our house, and I bet that's still true in a lot of your houses now. Huh? The woman controls the relationships. It's a trade-off, I guess. We bring in the money and fix the awnings on Saturday, and she controls the relationships. And that's where all the learning is at. That's where all the wisdom is at. So we handed over Holy Sophia, as it's called in the scriptures, by and large to the feminine side. And what brought you to men's work, brothers, is, I believe, a deep attraction for what's the male shape of wisdom. And because we clergy, and all of our denominations are imputed in this, we clergy largely bought into, because it was the only game in town, a transactional understanding of ministry, all right? If you were Catholic or Orthodox, it was all about the checklist of having received the appropriate sacraments. If you were Protestant, it was, and I shouldn't say this in the wonderful 500th anniversary of Luther, but it was all about finding the right scripture quotes and memorizing them if possible. Not necessarily letting them turn you upside down. It was still transactional. Lest you have any doubt, what we're talking about in Illuman, in the old days what we called males, is transformational religion. That this really changes. That Pauline conversion I was taught, that I think differently. I process the moment differently. And things like racism just don't make sense anymore. The fact that racism, which thank God you addressed so beautifully this afternoon, has persisted at the highest levels of Christianity in every one of our denominations. The fact that homophobia has persisted, well, still dominates most of our denominations at the highest levels, tells me that we have not yet entered into transformational religion. It's mostly transactional. Just transactional, you know? And, you know, let's get real close to home. 82% of white evangelicals, you know who they voted for in this last election. This is calling white I make note of, not brown, not black, not yellow, not red, white.
Thank God it was only 52% of Catholics, but I'm even insulted at that we cannot see the difference between Jesus of Nazareth, this man, the humble one, meek and humble of heart, who gives himself for the world. And when a choice was placed before us, so many people could not see the difference. This tells us we are still dealing with infantile Christianity. As we said at the Trinity Conference in April, I think the first 2,000 years of Christianity will be called early Christianity. And William Paul Young jumped in and he said, and we don't mean the 7 a.m. service either. I don't think we've begun to get the points of this, the point of this, the implications of this, the clear moral implications of what you say is the nature of God. If this is the nature of God, then the nature of our politics is blasphemous, all right? And that anybody can take it seriously. And I'm not saying that in a partisan way, because we don't have elders on either side. And when we can't even look to leadership in church or state, now Pope Francis is trying to turn around our leadership. Just pray he can last 5 more years. Maybe he can begin to do it. But for the most part, let's be honest. To join ministry or to be ordained a priest was a career move, right? It was not a move downward, it was a move upward. That's why most of the cultures of the world deemed male initiation absolutely necessary for survival. Because the intuition of the testosterone-driven male psyche is up, 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 climbing, power, money, war, control. This man, Jesus, led us in a different direction. But most of us haven't accepted it yet. So when I started reading everything I could in around 1990, 91, and I read for 5 years the cross-cultural phenomenon of initiation, here was the one-line conclusion it led me to, that African peoples, Native Americans, Aboriginal people, the old Celts in Europe, again and again deemed that if the young male was not led on journeys of powerlessness, down, he would always abuse power. There it is, one sentence. And so they had to find a way for cultural survival to assure that the young male, ideally between 13 and 17, made some journeys of powerlessness. I see no evidence that they were wrong. Of course, we haven't had initiation in most Western countries for 1,000 years, and even a lot of people who look at us, our Mankind Project, think it's, some kind of getting naked in the woods and having fun with drums. That's true, too. But it isn't the point, So we got our work cut out for us. We got a lot of work cut out for us. So did I explain them all? The lover, of course, I didn't talk about enough, except the contact with the feminine, which ideally the gay person, the transgender person, has a head start on. Isn't that a shame that we'd hate them? Of course we would, because they're not like us. And we want all of them to be like us, because we're the norm, aren't we? Aren't we the norm? White, Christian, so-called healthy, heterosexual, comfortable people. We've got to recognize that ain't the norm of anything great. Right? It was normally called bourgeois society. Low-level sophistication that thinks it's much farther along the path than it is. Those of you who were here 2 years ago, forgive me for even mentioning it, but I remember I taught you integral theory and the 9 levels of consciousness. I don't have time to teach it tonight, but if you want to look it up on Google, it's called spiral dynamics or integral theory. Most of the developmental psychologists worldwide are coming to a consensus. There's a direction to growth. There's a similarity to the schemas of Piaget, Fowler, Kohlberg, Erik Erikson, Bill Plotkin, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and they all see that the psyche moves toward more non-dual thinking. It starts totally dualistic and therefore violent. When you're dualistic, you will be violent. Got it? When you frame entire reality, and the best you can do is Republican, Democrat, and think because you chose one side, you're smart, all right? That's a stupid people, all right? That's a recipe for stupidity. That's called dualistic thinking, where only two options are presented us, and we think because we opted for one, we're wise. That we've been bought off. We've been bought off that way to believe such silliness. So those who are trying to chart growth say, we become more inclusive, less violent, more non-dual, and they go together. Less need to defend ourselves because I am who I am, who I am, who I am, who I am. I've faced my shadow. I've done my shadow work. I'm not surprised by my shadow anymore, so I'm not upset if you see it too, right? I've met the enemy is me, and I have nothing to lose. Now, I don't know that we get there before our 70s, to be honest. Some of you who've suffered more get there much earlier. And let me try to draw it together on that, if there's any drawing of this together. But, Jesus says, and he is my primary teacher, have no doubt of that, because you just can't beat him on all the major points. He says, there's one baptism that I want to give you. And it's not this being dunked in water, that we divided over that. How much water, who did it, what were the words, who cares, Who cares? That's transactional religion. And those are the things we divided over. We divided whole denominations over who and when the water was poured and who did the pouring and what words were said, He said, the only baptism that matters to me is the baptism of fire and the Spirit. And he describes it in all four of the Gospels as a baptism of blood. Now, here's the way I say this, and those of you who've gone through the living school, forgive me that this is surely repetitive, but I've learned to use it a lot in the last 2 years because a lot of men remember almost geometric images. I say, picture 3 boxes: order, disorder, reorder, all right? What we all start with, if you have the easy start, is you start in a box of supposed order. What your family in Washington State told you it means to be an American and a male. And that's the easiest way to start, which means the easiest way to start is conservative, with some traditional values that define for you good and evil, right and wrong. You have a box that's worth unpackaging, at least, but you have a box. Now, most conservatives, or people who call themselves conservative, most uninitiated people, remain perpetually in box 1. They just keep defending, protecting, hardening the silo of order. That's why they love to use the language of law and order. Apply that to the appropriate politicians, all right? Whenever you're talking law and order, you're a first box person. People who aren't so enamored with law and order are people who've experienced that the law and order isn't always on their side. In fact, it's often unjust. Now, that's the second box. That was introduced to the Jewish people by the prophets, who came and disrupted the Jewish order by saying, all of your explanations, Jewish people, you're phonies, you're hypocrites, you're prostitutes, you're prostituting yourselves on the high places. The prophets are always reaming out the order of Israel. And yet, they were Orthodox Jews. You see now what we mean when we call Jesus the last and greatest of the prophets. When you can put together loyalty to order while ability to also critique order, you put the first and the second box together. Got it? I would say that's
Less than 10% of people I know, easily, probably less than 5. Most of them are trapped in the first box, whereas now, don't feel too complacent. If you call yourself liberal or progressive or broad-minded, or you're probably trapped, very often trapped in the second box. It's what we call postmodern chaos. What's Ken Wilber's term again? Aperspectival madness. He says we live in a country, aperspectival. There's no privileged perspective. Everybody's on their own. That's the last thing Merton said in his last talk before he died in 68. He said, you're all on your own now. Because once there is no possible moral order or moral vision for reality that we can agree upon, if everybody's on their own, we're going to have the kind of America we have today. Largely fraught with anger and increasing violence. Because there's nothing to give the mind or the heart coherence. Aperspectival madness. It makes people very angry. Because you need, brothers, a sense of basic order. There is a moral meaning to this universe. It's coming from somewhere good. It's going to somewhere good. When you know that, you can go to sleep at peace at night, you know? It's no accident that we're having an opioid crisis, all right? I'd be filling myself with drugs too, because it's an incoherent world. Nothing means nothing. It's called nihilism. Nihil is the Latin word for nothing. Means nothing. And initiation was to tell the young boy it means something. It's coming from somewhere good. Initiation was always done in nature. You know why? Because it always revealed not just a morality, but a cosmology. It united the boy to the universe. And our native peoples, who we dismissed as animists, they kiss trees and they love animals, you know. Now we're recognizing they recognize the mystery of the incarnation better than most Christians do. And the people we called pagans and animists, who saw the divine spirit in all things, were very often far ahead of most organized Christians I meet today, who think God can only be found in Bibles and sacraments and churches and priestcraft, you know. This won't work, because once you define God as only here and not there, then most of the world is bereft. Most of the world is empty. Most of the world is profane. Your ordinary occupations, your ordinary jobs where you're being a warrior each day, they're not holy. You know, you got to run to Sunday school to become holy. That's the schizophrenia we're living in with a non-incarnational Christianity. So when the lover doesn't get integrated, that was a long excursus on the false lover, but he becomes an addict. That's American society. And Western Europe isn't any different, or Australia isn't any different. I don't mean to just pick on us. So, brothers, we got our work cut out for us. The best thing you can do for your sons and your grandsons is to just keep growing up yourself. All right? You can only give away what you already have. And you can't give it away if you don't have it. And how do you give it away? It's not taught by any kind of didactic thing like I'm doing right now. It's caught. It's caught as energy. When they see how dad drives the car and treats the person who pushes in front of them. You can talk about going to church all you want. And if you're an angry, pissed off man at anybody who offends you, all right, your boy is going to be an angry, pissed off boy, all right? And you know who's responsible? You. And he's going to do like you have practiced. So what you give is your energy to your sons. And of course, that's what they desperately want from you, which is why they want to play baseball with you, why they want to go fishing with you. It's not really to catch the fish, it's to get the energy, to catch you. And of course, if there's no willingness to to talk about to them about deeper things, they'll go to mama for spiritual wisdom because dad, frankly, doesn't have any. And then they go to the church and they find out all the priest has is laws and commandments, right? You do know, both Jesus and Paul are very hard on law. You wouldn't think that, would you? Because we were given a version of them that it was all about obeying laws. That's only when religion has stayed in box one. So here's where authority comes from. The authority comes from holding on to what was true and good and eternal in the first box. And it always was. Don't throw it all out. Recognizing what is good and necessary about the second box of disorder. That there is injustice. Life isn't fair. It isn't like I first ideally thought. I grew up in Kansas, where everything's sort of bland. No offense, Kansans, but and everybody thinks the same. And my father told me they put a black man in the 4th of July parade, and they put him on a float just so they could see what a black person looked like. They didn't put him down, but he was that rare, Never, hardly met a Protestant, really. We were a little Catholic ghetto. All very nice. Order, 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 order. Then I went off to the Franciscans. Order, 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 order. But thank God I went to college in the 60s and studied theology. In the late 60s, disorder, 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 disorder. But I had internalized enough of the values from order that the disorder didn't scare me. I thank God many times for my age, for the ideal time to be raised in this very traditional conservative world, see what was good about it and what was unnecessary and not even good at all, to be introduced to the second box of disorder, and then to dip my toe, and that's all I can say, in the third box of reorder. That's ordination. That's legitimation. That's spiritual authority. Not first box people, not second box people. Second box people only make you into cynics. They make you angry. They make you into cheap liberals. Not non-dual thinkers. They get as angry on the liberal side as the conservatives do on the conservative side. It's the same dualistic mind. So ordination is to learn how to live in the third box. If you want to call it the resurrected life, the life of the soul. In Falling Upward, I called it the second half of life, although I wrote about it with some hesitation because I'm not sure I'm living there fully. I think I touch upon it at times. But one of the wonderful things about an elder, I'm almost ready to stop, is that you don't need to prove you're an elder. When we have, I won't mention names, certain politicians tell us how smart they are. You see, that's the giveaway that they're not. I guess you know that. Because when you're really an elder, you don't need to advertise it. You don't need to push it. You don't need to push yourself. You don't need to defend yourself. You stand on your own authority. You stand on the inherent truth of what you're saying and the fruit that comes from it. And that's why a father passes on his energy by contagion. So that's the baptism that matters. That's the initiation that matters. Whatever gets you through the second box, and don't plant your camp there. And I think that's one unique thing about our men's movement, as tiny as we are, is we're trying to point to a risen, transformed life. Not liberals, right? Who are still into winning and proving they're right and proving the first box people wrong. You've been given, I think, a much better agenda. Luke's gospel says you are children of the resurrection. So the risen life is a life that has gone through crucifixion. There is no non-stop flight from the first box to the third box. Got it? Did you hear me? All right. And so don't feel bad. Oh, I had to go into the second box. Stop it. This is the only path of transformation there is. Jesus promised it. That's what this means. That's why he's holding his wounds. Even his resurrected body holds the wounds. This was my glory. This was my way through. These are my trophies, as Julian of Norwich says. So brothers, that's why we talk about wounding so much in our work. Your wounds are your trophies, if they've led you to the third box, all right? If you're still whining, if you're still trying to create victims, if you're still trying to prove who's right and who's wrong, instead of realizing we're all complicit in the wrong and we're all participating in the right, huh? We're all, as Luther said in this month of Luther, simul justus et peccator. I gave, right before I stopped traveling when I turned 75 years ago, I was at a conference in Switzerland with Lutheran theologians, one of the last I did. And the title of the conference was Martin Luther a Mystic? I was the only Catholic. All the rest were Lutheran theologians. And of course, I wasn't going to say anything, you know. I let them come to their own conclusions. They said he was a mini mystic, but then he became angrier and angrier and angrier. Of course, we painted him into that corner. But when he offers lines like simul justus et peccator, simultaneously a justified man and a sinner, a field of weeds and wheat, letting them both grow together at the same time. That's precisely the third box, huh? When you faced your weeds, you recognize the first interview that Pope Francis said. They said, "Who are you?" The man from Argentina, and he said, "I'm a sinner." First words out of his mouth, right? So you guys don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to pretend you're not. You are, all right? We're all in this together. We don't have to push ourselves higher or better than we really are. I hope for you, brothers, that's a declaration of freedom. And a lot of people are afraid of freedom. Don't misuse it. Don't use it just for yourself, to make yourself a little more comfortable or a little more powerful or a little more important. Because when you live in the third box, I think you have an eldership, you have a fatherhood, you have an inner confidence, you have an inner authority to hold an awful lot together. And we got an awful lot to hold together. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I think we're going to walk out now and have our night prayer. I offered to open this up to question and response, but they thought it would go on for 3 hours. So we're going to leave you to the Holy Spirit to fill in all those gaps that I didn't fill in. But before we go out to our beautiful night prayer, we'll gather approximately like we did last night. Let me teach you while you're in here, because the sound is better, what I'm going to do. Some of you know this already. It's the second chapter of my book, The Naked Now, where I discovered from a Jewish rabbi that the holy name for God that was described to us as the name we should not take in vain. Do not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. And this rabbi said, you Christians got it all wrong. You think it means you're not supposed to say, God damn it. Well, I hope you don't say, God damn it. That's sort of rude and crude. But that isn't even close to what the commandment means. He said, any attempt to speak with your lips and your tongue the sacred name of God is in vain. Right? God is always mystery. God will never be knowable by the human mind. And when religion forgets that, it becomes idolatrous. It worships itself instead of God. We don't allow God to be eternal, infinite mystery. And then he already has us in the palm of his hand. This was up in Santa Fe 15 years ago. And then he says, let me tell you what the sacred name is. Now, those of you who are allowed to pronounce it, It's usually pronounced something like this, Yahweh. He said, if you take those consonants that word is spelled with, they do not allow you to close your lips or use your tongue. They demand that you keep the vocal channel completely open. And he said, in fact, the sacred name is an attempt to imitate and replicate the sound of exhalation and inhalation. There were gasps all over the room. None of us had ever heard that before. And then this wonderful rabbi did it right in the room. Some of the Jewish people were in tears. He did it about 30 times. And he said, do you realize what this means? It means the first word you ever spoke when you came out of your mother's body was the name of God. It's natural. And it's how Adam is created, the breath flowing into the body of Adam. The matter and spirit are one from the very beginning, and the breath and the spirit are the same word, of course, in so many languages. How good is that? And the last word you're ever going to speak in your deathbed moment will come for each one of us. And we'll largely have to do it alone. So what initiation was about was dying ahead of time, so the last one you weren't shocked by or surprised by. Huh? But the last word you'll ever pronounce, if this is true, is the sacred name of God. But the story gets better. Then a few years later, I was invited to Grand Rapids, Michigan. Some of you are from there, to talk at the Fetzer Institute. And they invited 35 contemplative teachers from all of the world religions. And we sat in a circle for 3 days. And I saved this, just like I'm doing with you, for the very last. And I was telling it to this circle. Immediately across from me in the circle was a Sufi teacher who I had come to deeply respect the whole 3 days. And I saw as I said this, he began to cry, literally, tears running down his cheeks. And as soon as we broke up, he ran across directly to me. He said, Father, what unneeded respect, but see, respectful people know how to respect everybody. They're not afraid of offering someone else respect. He said, Father, do you know what the Islamic name for God is? I said, yeah. He said, spell it for me. I said, no, I think I'm right, A-L-L''H. He said, that's correct. Now he said, do you know what that literally means in the Arabic language? I said, no, I guess I don't. Well, he said, I'm going to tell you. And he's looking right in my eyes. When you put 2 L's, it's sort of like Spanish. When you put 2 L's together, but it has a different meaning for them, it means the very. The second L is like an exclamation point, all right? It's to emphasize. So he says, here's the Arabic, Islamic name for God. The very ha. Got it? Allah. And he just wept. He said, here, my people have thought we had to hate the Jewish people. The Jewish people thought they had to hate us. You can see we go back to a primitive understanding of God. That God was the very air. That God was uncontrollable, as Jesus says in John 3. You cannot control where the Spirit comes from. And the great idolatry of priesthood and ministers is that we thought we could. But it gets better. And one more. Then, only about 5 years ago, I was invited to a wonderful Pacific Rim conference in Hawaii. Now, that wasn't a hard invitation to accept. And I'm saying this to this room filled with Hawaiians, and they start crying. And they break right in. They said, do you know what the Hawaiian name for God is? It's Ha. Ha. It can't really be pronounced. It can only be breathed. Full circle, full circle. This stuff is, that's all you need to hear. You can forget everything else I said. We've returned religion to natural religion. And what we thought about was the window dressing, all the window dressing of the historical accidents that each of our denominations largely is. Doesn't make them wrong. I can still honor what's good about the first box. And there always was. As many have said, the deepest intuitions of religion are correct. It's just they formulate them in wooden, mechanical ways that you're so tied to the same words like Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And Catholics just say that and do that in a catatonic way. And the mystery of flow that it really represents and flow inside the body is a mystery they don't get anymore. So it's almost counterproductive to keep doing it. You understand? You've got to break it. You've got to bring in the disorder and then rediscover it on a whole new level. So I hope, brothers, that's what we're doing in all of our men's work. I'm not interested in changing any of your dogmas or doctrines or belief systems, but let's just say, what do they really mean? Don't throw them all out, right? Don't surrender to them on bended knee, and don't spend your middle years fighting them. So it'll get you into negative energy, and once you get in that pit, you can't get back out of it. So don't waste time in negative energy. We're going to go out and breathe in the New Mexico night air and know that it is the breath of God, and it is given equally to every one of you in this room if you're willing to breathe. Are you willing to breathe? Let's go. Okay, thank you.